There was a moment this week that didn't sit right with me. And it wasn't because there was something big, it wasn't a big situation, but it didn't sit right because it felt so familiar in a way that I just could not ignore. And it was simple, really. It was just that someone asked me a question and I answered it. Harmless enough. It was a quick, clean, there was no friction in the question or my response. And that happens all the time. Team comes and they ask questions. It's pretty routine. But right after that question landed and I responded, there was this quiet gut check inside of me. Now, it wasn't logical, it wasn't strategic, it was just simply a quiet gut check. Just this knowing, if you will. And it was subtle, or at least it felt subtle. And it was just this knowing that said, that wasn't yours to hold. Why is that coming back to you? And, and at first, I was a little like taken back, but I didn't brush past it. So often we will ignore it, brush past it, whatever. And I'm guilty of that too. But in this moment, I didn't brush past it because I've learned. I've learned that when something is that subtle and it's also that clear at the exact same time, I have learned through trial and error many times not listening to my own knowing. So I didn't brush past it. And I learned that when that happens, when it's that subtle, when it seems that clear at the same time, that it's not actually noise. We oftentimes want to just brush past it and think it's just noise and we'll ignore it and just keep moving forward because that's what we've trained ourselves to do. But what I've learned and what I tuned into this time is that it's actually alignment trying to get your attention. There's just this subtlety underneath that's trying to get your attention, to point out something that we for too long have been normalizing, therefore ignoring. Have you ever had that happen? Something looks so completely normal on the surface. It's something that we do day in and day out. It's something that we have patterned and have created a habit for, and we do time and time again without thinking about it. It's so completely normal on the surface, but internally, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel clean and clear. And normally we just push past it, we ignore it, we brush it off because the way we're being is the way we've always been. Now, I mean, that's not wrong. It's not even chaotic. Other people might think so, but when it's happening to you, it doesn't feel wrong. It doesn't feel chaotic. It just feels off. And you know that feeling you get when something's just off. You may not always be able to put your finger to it, but you know that something just feels off, just not landing quite like you would expect it to, or it has in the past. And that's usually a good sign. That's usually a big sign if we don't ignore it, if we don't push past it, because that's usually where things are already starting to break. Not outwardly, because outwardly, everything looks like it's operating as intended. Everything looks like it's moving as it should. So it's not that things feel like they're starting to break outwardly, but it is an issue with the structure. It is an indication that structurally something is not working. It is an indication that energetically something's not landing, that things are off. And just because something's been normalized and because we've conditioned and behaved in that habitual pattern doesn't mean that it's actually working. And what I realized in that moment was big because I realized it wasn't about the question at all. It actually was just about what it represented because it was pointing out to me things that might be broken. And too often we push past it, we blow it off, we ignore it, we don't think we have time for it, we'll get to it later, or we overgeneralize it simply because, well, it's the norm and it's what we do and it's the way we've always been and it's always worked. So we just keep going. But what I realized in that moment is it wasn't about the question. It was about what it represented because when it came to me, I realized that that wasn't a question that had to come to me because I was the only one who could answer it. And that was like a big light bulb that went off because somewhere along the way, the truth is the authority had been trained to sit with me. That's why it was coming back to me. That's why something felt off because I kept thinking, this didn't have to land here. Why did it route back to me? And the truth is, because I've trained for the authority to come back to me. We've trained the authority to come back as leaders to you. And that's where this conversation actually starts because in that moment, in that realization, it was so subtle, but so powerful about realizing that without intention necessarily, the way things have been trained to function weren't working because I've trained them to come back to me, which isn't what I want, but it's what was happening. And this is where when the conversation, when you slow down to really think about it and not push past it, this is where your faith, we talk about that internal knowing, the one that you felt right before you answered that question. I know I felt it, but it's your faith showing up. It's that part of you that is telling you, hey, this doesn't belong to you. That tap on the shoulder, that gut, that knowing that's like, this doesn't belong to me. This isn't mine. This didn't need to come back to me. Why am I getting the question? So when your faith is showing up and it's trying to get your attention, that's God trying to get your attention, trying to help you see something, to recognize something, to bring your attention and your awareness to something. And it's not loudly done. And it's not dramatic. It's not chaotic. It's not over the top, right? But even so, when your faith is trying to show you where there's a disconnect, where things aren't clear, where things have likely broken down, have some cracks. It's trying to get your attention because until you're aware of it, you can't address it. Which means that your fire, that fire in your belly, the one that keeps you going, the one that keeps you motivated, the one that helps you burn for your vision and put everything on the map and put your heart and soul into everything you're doing, your fire is actually what it takes to honor that knowing. It's not just enough for your faith to show up trying to get your attention. It's that fire that burns so brightly that also requires you to have that activation to honor the knowing so that when it shows up, you're willing to stand in it. you're willing to pause, to redirect, to hold the line, even when it feels uncomfortable. And yes, when these moments show up where you're like, that didn't need to come back to me, and your faith is showing up so loudly and your fire is roaring, yes, it does feel uncomfortable. Because the truth is, it is uncomfortable. These moments, with these moments are so uncomfortable because when you know you can handle it, right? It- but it shouldn't have to come back to you. And those are wake up calls. Those are moments of awareness that get to help us uncover something beneath the surface of our leadership. So, what happens is your faith shows up, your fire is really roaring to get the attention, to make these connections. So, your frequency is what your business calibrates to. And in the moments where your frequency says things like, I'll take it, and we've all done that. I'll take it. I've got it. I'll handle it. We've all done that for whatever reasons, oftentimes out of frustration because it's routed back to us, because we believe that um, if we do so, it'll get done the right way. There won't be any question, any doubt. Your structure begins to organize around that. Not because your team lacks something, they don't. They're fully capable in all of these moments. But your system has learned that you are where the authority lives. Put simply, your system has learned that everything routes back to you. And so the structure organizes around that. The business operates from that space. That means your team isn't lacking anything, but they also don't feel like they have the autonomy to do and move forward without it coming back to you. And the truth is that that authority, it doesn't break in big moments, right? Because in big moments, you're fully present, you are standing guard, and you're pushing forward the momentums. You are on point and you're moving everything through. So your authority doesn't typically break in those big moments. It's in the small details, right? The devil's always in the details. And then authority is in the details as well. It's in those small moments. The quick answers, the easy yeses, the fast decisions, the ones that are so normal, they just zip right through and you just take control of them and you do them. And no one thinks twice about coming to you for all of that. But every time you step in, it's like every time you step in, you reinforce where authority belongs. And most people, most leaders don't realize how often they're actually pulling it back. It happens so automatically. It is so patterned and conditioned in the way you lead that you don't realize how often you're pulling that back. You don't even recognize it most of the time unless you get a moment of pause and of clarity where something just feels off enough that you're like, And instead of brushing past it, you stop and pay attention. You see, because it's not about control. It's not from control at all. In fact, it's because you care and you have conditioned to believe that your speed will get it done because you already know what needs to be done. You already have everything here. So it's more about capability and speed and You're just taking it on, taking it back, pulling it back to you. The problem is, the problem is that capability isn't the issue because you can have a strong team, you can have a kick butt team that is on fire and still have misdirected authority. It happens all the time. And you know when it happens. You feel it, you hear it, you see it. You know when it's happening. You might not always want to acknowledge it, might be pushing past it, but you know when it happens. And when it happens, you want the responsibility to sit with the team. You want the responsibility to sit with those individuals. But the decision making still sits with you. That's misaligned. You want the authority to land with them and for ownership to happen, but all of the decision making still sits with you. And that gap is huge because that gap is where everything starts leaking. And like a slow drip, it's constant and it's subtle, but it builds over time. So when everything starts leaking, it really is your time, your energy, your clarity, because it's constantly being pulled back, being sucked back in into spaces and places that you thought you had already had delegation for others to own. But it's not what's happening. So when everything starts leaking, your time, your energy, your clarity, this gap that really exists that is begging for you to pay attention to, right? So now you recognize that you've become the place where everything lands, everything. And you're starting to recognize how that sucks up your time and energy, how frustrating it is. But you're starting to see where you have created this pattern. So you start recognizing that everything is landing with you. This is where the decisions are being finalized. And this is where movement actually happens. And you start noticing that with your team and with your staff and with everyone around you. Because this doesn't happen just in business, this also happens in our life. But you start noticing it. And yes, it looks like leadership. It looks like what we've been taught is leadership for delegation and where authority and ownership lie and how execution takes place and the structures of organizations and how we function. But it's not. Because when everything routes back to you, when all of decisions come back to you, when you're the stopgap for everything, for execution, for movement, for decisions, for the authority to constantly be coming back to you, it's not leadership, it's dependency. Now, it's dressed up as responsibility and it looks good on the outside, but you know, you're back to that knowing, that internal knowing where it doesn't feel aligned, it feels off. But that's where it is. And if you brush past that initial moment, you're watching this repeat until you're willing to slow down and pay attention. Lean into your faith, listen, and allow that fire to activate so that you shift in that frequency. So I want you to think about your last week. How many times did something come back to you that shouldn't have needed to? Think about that. How many times in the last week did something come back to you that shouldn't have needed to? And how did you feel? What did you say in that moment? Where was the frustration? Where was the leak? Your time, your energy, what was that? And even though you were frustrated, and even though you didn't think that it needed to come back to you, you also knew that it wouldn't move without you. Nobody was taking a step. Nobody was taking another action. Nobody was breathing because nothing was going to move without you. And then I want you to think about how many times did you step in? I mean, honestly, be honest with yourself. How many times did you step in and not because you wanted control, but because you believed that it was necessary? Think about that. How many times, and I'm sure at first you're going to think, I didn't at all. But if you're honest with yourself and you take a moment to really think about how many times you stepped in because you felt it was necessary, you can start to recognize the pattern. And it's important that you do, because it's not leadership when you keep routing everything back to you, when you train the system to land with you. Right? This is the pattern that I want you to start to recognize, because over time, it starts to feel normal, which is why it's so difficult to see, which is why it's so hard to recognize at first. You really have to be able to pay attention. But when you do, like, this is just what leadership requires. And if you want to be holding it all together, if you are constantly feeling as though you're holding it all together, that you are constantly needing to be the final word, the final say so, that everything stops with you, that you are carrying all the weight. And how many times have you ever mumbled that or said it out loud about how you're feeling about having to carry all the weight? Everything's coming back to you. You're always having to make the decisions. You don't understand why other people aren't making these decisions, moving things forward. Why is it that everything comes back to you? You're carrying all the weight. You're being the final say so. Because it's not leadership that way. But I want you to recognize and understand that it's just that while it's not leadership, it's the structure that never fully shifted. It's how you unintentionally, most likely, created the structure in your business or in your life, and you've organized it in such a way that these patterns have repeated themselves to become the norm, that you don't even recognize it until somebody else points it out. But then once they do, then there's the possibility to shift, to make change, to look at the structure and determine where you actually want it, how you want it to interact, and what you want it to do operationally. So I had a client recently, an incredible leader. She had built a really strong team. Everything looked right. Chef's kiss. She'd done everything right. She had built this team. She took her vision and she brought it to life. And everything looked right. And from the outside in, if you were looking at this business, you would think, very successful. Wow, she's done everything right. This is amazing. But she kept asking herself the same thing that I mentioned before. And she kept saying, why is everything still coming back to me? Why does it always come back to me? And it was the question that she asked me. Why is this happening? So we slowed it way down. We pulled everything back for her to recognize that it actually wasn't her leadership per se. It was more that everything was still coming back to her because of the design. It was the placement of it, if you will. You see, her team had full responsibility, and they were working really hard, and they were working really well, and they were getting things done. And while they had responsibility, they did not have authority. And it wasn't something she could clearly see. That gap was not something that she could recognize. And so everything was routing back to her, because while the team had a lot of responsibility, they had no authority. So they do what all good teams do. They executed on the direction, they executed, but they weren't given the autonomy to decide. So the question was, why is everything still coming back to me? And it's because of the structure that was put into place. So the team, while they had responsibility, while they could execute, they couldn't make those final decisions. They couldn't make those decisions. So every real decision that the team needed in order to move forward, to make progress, everything kept coming back to her. Every decision routing back to her, which meant nothing was moving without her. So she became the bridge, right? She became that bridge between action and decision. She became the bridge between her team, the responsibility, and the authority to decide and to move. She became the bridge between that movement and clarity, because right now it was muddled. And so, of course, everything was routing back to her. And I'm sure you've all felt it, how exhausting that can be when you are running your business, you are in the throes of your leadership, and you're constantly having those stops and interruptions because everything's coming back to you. Yes, of course, that is exhausting because when nothing fully moves without you, you never feel like you can get out from under it to take care of everything else that requires your attention. So once we were able to slow down and look at that, we didn't change the people. We also didn't add more to their plates. But what we did was huge, because what we actually did was shift where the authority lived, which was not easy, but necessary. It was uncomfortable, but was going to yield the greatest reward. So while we didn't change the people and we didn't add more to their plates, we did shift where the authority lived. So we shifted who actually gets to make some decisions, who gets to decide. We shifted where ownership truly ends. We shifted the patterns. We shifted what was normal to what could become the new normal. And once all of that shifted, she was so surprised to see how everything moved so differently. And it didn't take a long time. I mean, this was a rather quick experience. And she almost immediately was able to recognize and was able to notice that decisions sped up. Things that were always coming back to her were not coming back to her now. Ownership became real. Her ownership, the team's ownership, it all became real. And because of that, she actually stopped being the bottleneck in her own business and honestly in her own life, because these patterns were showing up not just in her business, but in her life as well. And when we were shifting things, those applications were being taken into both spaces. And so she was experiencing a lot of shift in her world. And it felt like so much weight was being lifted. This isn't just operational. This isn't just structural, right? This is where your leadership starts to distort, when everything is routed back, when there's unclear authority, when there's unclear ownership, when it's unclear about the decision-making process. This is where your leadership starts to distort, because when everything routes back to you, you actually stop leading from clarity, because you don't have time to stay in that space. And because of that, you start leading from pressure. there's this pressure to always be available, to always answer every question, to always fix it, to always pick it up and make it happen. So what happens then is your fire turns to force, right? Because now you're under pressure. And so your faith turns into this gripped holding pattern, because your fire is now in this space of force instead of burning motivation. And so what is happening to your frequency? When you're not making these shifts, when you're breezing past all of this, when you're not taking the time to see where the leadership is creating the gap and see where your leadership is becoming the bridge for things unintended, then you start carrying more than you're meant to. So your frequency tunes into that. And so what happens is that over time, you don't just lead the business, right? Because your frequency is matching what you've put out, what you've constructed, what you've shown to be the patterns and the habits. So you actually become the container for all of it. And you're not leading the business. You never feel like you get to actually be in the space of leading the business because you're so busy running the business, but everything's coming back to you. So then you become the container that holds it all together because you're holding it all, which oftentimes feels like if you were to take a breath or take a step back, it would all fall apart. So if this feels familiar to you, I don't want you to ignore it. If any of this feels a bit familiar at all, I don't want you to ignore it. I want you to recognize that this is not just awareness. This conversation is not just about bringing awareness to the surface. It really is much more about an invitation, because we can't just be aware of it and then ignore it or not do anything about it, push it off to the side, or never pay attention to the patterns, right? So if this feels familiar, I want to invite you to look at where your authority is sitting. And I want you to look, like, get really honest. And I want you to really look about whether or not your business is built to carry itself, or is it still calibrated back to you? So everything's coming back to you, and you're still sitting in that place of, like my client, where she's asking, why is everything still coming back to me? And if that's not what you want, then it's time that we go beyond awareness and we take a deeper look. Because once your authority is actually placed correctly, once you align that authority, everything starts to move without your forcing it. Again, hear me when I say that once your authority is placed correctly, once you have taken the blinders off and you've chosen to pay attention and you've chosen to look deeper into the structure and your part of it and your leadership's part of it, everything starts to move without you forcing it. So pressure is lifted, weight is lifted, your leadership is realigned, things are shifting, and you're no longer holding it all, right? So you don't feel the weight anymore because there's too much. And you'll start feeling it because too much still belongs to you if you don't have any of those shifts. Because you don't feel the weight because there's too much for you. You feel it because so much still belongs to you that you've never put it down, that you're always still carrying it, even when you've built the team that should be able to take care of it and handle it for you. So if any of this was familiar, I hope that you'll take a moment, more than one, and actually explore where your habits and your patterns are showing up that keep having everything route right back to you.
Leadership isn't what you perform, it's what you embody. If this conversation resonated, share it with someone ready to lead differently. And remember, when your faith ignites your fire amplifies your frequency. Until next time.